As another air attack happens from Russia into Ukraine that sets yet another record, and facilities are burning all over Ukraine, the front line continues to crumble. We still have Western leaders and Ukraine leaders just unwilling to acknowledge simple reality. Though, fortunately, some Western countries, some NATO members, are starting to come closer into focus on what reality is. And to try to help us make some sense out of what in the world some of these senior leaders on the disconnected side are saying and what that really means, we have Colonel Doug Macgregor back with us today, defense and foreign policy analyst, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, highly decorated combat veteran, and big friend of the show. Doug, as always, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here, Dan.
Well, listen, I mean, we keep having physical evidence that shows in increasing numbers that this war is lost already, that the Ukraine side has lost it, the Russian side has won it, and the only thing that still has to be determined is how big the casualty count will be on the Ukraine side before the end is manifest on the ground, and how much longer we'll go to disbelieve that. But we have evidence on the ground with this huge strike again overnight, 800 drones, and I think 40 some odd missiles that were involved with all of that. Allegedly, a lot of those are shot down, but now even the Ukraine's admitting a bunch of them are getting through. We have lots of video evidence. The actual parliament building was hit for the first time. Russia attacked that. They're moving in on the ground. General Syrskyi himself admitted that Russia has a 3-time advantage that Ukraine cannot overcome. And yet we don't seem to accept that that's the case. And our actions, both Europe and the United States, and certainly Ukraine with Zelensky, still seems to be acting like there's choices to make. What do you make of this?
I think to some extent we failed to read the signals that are frankly very clear from Moscow. And Moscow has concluded that they can no longer bet on any sort of reasonable approach from Washington, D.C. I think the offensive to finish off the Ukrainian armed forces has not necessarily been paused, but certainly slowed by the hope, frankly, that the meeting with President Trump would have delivered something. I listened to some remarks by President Putin recently, and hearing what he had to say about the future and whether or not there would be any meetings was really a comment, I think, on what happened in Alaska. Because he said if a meeting is to be held and it involves preparation by both sides, meaning systematic study, detailed proposals, then we're certainly happy to meet. We have never rejected any request for a meeting. He said, but there has to be preparation, there has to be serious study and a serious proposal before we get together. And I think what he's really doing is he's talking about what happened in Alaska. Alaska was exactly what many of us thought it was, Dan. It was another Trump reality TV show. It was designed to wow people, to make them see this great and powerful president surrounded by combat aircraft, that we were signaling to the Russians that we're strong, and people that don't know any better were saying, well, he's being strong to Russia. He has to do that. You know how the Russians are. I think that's over now. And I think what Putin and his inner circle have decided, with the full backing of the Russian population, we're going to have to sort this out on our own. And if the Americans or anybody else wants to talk to us, well, then we'll talk to them, but not seriously until we see evidence that they've studied our proposals and have their own. So I think that's really what the attack was all about. The attack was a wake-up call. This thing isn't over. If you think that we've been lulled into a false sense of security by the meeting with Trump, you're wrong. We are pressing ahead, and you have a choice. But there's something else, too, that's not too subtle here. The attack on Kiev, particularly in proximity to the cabinet meeting, was a signal that the game is over. If you think you're going to sit there with splendid immunity from prosecution by the Russian armed forces, it's over. You're fair game now. You're no longer legitimate in our eyes. You won't talk reasonably. So we'll kill you if necessary.
Well, that message doesn't seem to have gotten through, at least not yet. This is President Trump, of course, was had a lot of optimism that he could get this deal done, that he could end the war. That started the whole series of things with the Anchorage meeting, with the Washington meeting that happened after that. Then the alleged deadlines, and the deadlines keep coming and going, and nothing ends up happening. And so now some of the cameras and some of the reporters are starting to press Trump a little bit more on, okay, what's going to happen next? Because none of this stuff you've talked about so far has materialized into any movement whatsoever from the Russian position, going back to June of last year. And on the tarmac yesterday, Trump got a little aggravated at the question again.
Are you ready to move to the second phase of sanctions against Russia or punishing Putin?
Russia, when do you plan to speak to President Putin next? And what might second...
Look, we're going to get it done. The Russia-Ukraine situation, we're going to get it done. I have confidence we're going to get it done.
In that same interview there, when he was sitting on the tarmac, he kept going back over and over to this, I've solved 7 wars already, and they were a lot harder than this one was. And I thought we'd get this one done, but we're going to get it done, and we're going to make an issue here. But as you just mentioned there, right before we showed that soundbite, there has been no actual diplomatic work done so that you can even find out what the contours would be. Trump never talks about how the war is going to come to an end, upon what conditions. And so where does that leave us?
Well, President Trump has actually done the complete 180-degree turn and joined President Biden and his administration in its hostility to Russia. If you listen to Trump, he's interested, and of course with his Treasury Secretary, in a new round of sanctions. And part of that involves threats, not only to Russia in terms of harming Russia, it's also about threats to people that otherwise would trade with us and work with us. Turkey, India, Brazil, and of course, China. Either you stop trade with Russia in oil and gas, or we're going to harm you as well. And I think it was Bessent who said, we're quite confident with this new second round of sanctions if our allies and partners, and that's a big if our allies, partners, and friends go along with us, we can, quote unquote, collapse the Russian economy. I think we've heard that one before.
Yeah. In fact, for anybody who may have missed it, Doug, I just could not believe my ears with what I heard on U.S. television yesterday. Here is Secretary Bessent making that claim.
President Trump, Vice President Vance had a very productive call with EU President Ursula von der Leyen on Friday. She followed up with a call with me, and we are talking about what can the two EU and the U.S. do together. And we are prepared to increase pressure on Russia, but we need our European partners to follow us, because if the U.S. and the EU do this together, we are in a race now between how long can the Ukrainian military hold up versus how long can the Russian economy hold up. And if the U.S. and the EU can come in, do more sanctions, secondary tariffs on the countries that buy Russian oil, the Russian economy will be in full collapse, and that will bring President Putin to the table.
I'm staggered that anyone, after 3.5 years of war, when we have tried everything in the book, to your point a second ago, they're trying to replay what Biden tried to do and destroy the Russian economy. And it utterly backfired. Not only did it fail, but it backfired. And now we're talking about doing it again. I mean, Doug, let me just ask, first of all, if the European Union actually did what Bessent is saying here, and he puts these sanctions that Lindsey Graham has called bone crushers, if they actually applied those on India, Brazil, et al., what would actually happen to our economies?
Well, our economy is already suffering as a result of these tariffs. Anybody who thinks the tariff war has somehow or another benefited us is, on a very bad set of drugs. The truth is that it's harmed us already. This is going to make matters much worse. But let's be frank. He needs to understand something that I guess is not widely understood in Washington. Ursula von der Leyen is the captain of the Titanic. The EU is finished as an organization. So is NATO, for that matter. But the EU is probably going to go under first. It's about as popular as the plague. It was supposed to be an institution that would facilitate trade and cross-border travel and so forth, that it became effectively an unelected dictatorship in which decisions would be made on how everyone in Europe would live in a uniform manner and behave in a uniform manner. What have we seen? We've seen lots of EU members have said, listen, we don't want millions of people from the Middle East and North Africa and Central Africa pouring into our countries. No, thank you very much. Number two, there are EU agreements already in place with China and Russia, and most members want to see those honored. I mean, the world is waking up to something, and we have not wakened up to it yet, that we are actually living on a much smaller planet than we originally thought. In other words, everybody really desperately needs and wants to do business with each other. The world is not really organized into hostile camps, armed to the teeth, ready to go to war. And I think the Europeans collectively are beginning to figure that out. And as a result, the globalist leaders who have pinned all of their hopes on this war with Russia as a way to, quote unquote, not only break Russia, but break Europe as well and drive everyone into this new globalist utopia. Places without borders, governments with overweening power over its populations. All of this is failing badly. So what you get is a return to hostility. Look at Hungary, look at Slovakia, Croatia, even little Slovenia. Everybody's looking at this and saying, this is not really what we want. The Austrians certainly don't want it. The president of Finland was interviewed recently, and he got as close to renouncing this dumb decision of joining NATO as I think he could at this point. But he raised the issue, said, perhaps what we've done isn't really sensible. Maybe it wasn't necessary. This is happening right now. Von der Leyen has no power whatsoever. She's increasingly a figurehead. Paris, London, and Berlin are the only ones really listening carefully to von der Leyen. The Dutch, the Norwegians aren't in it, but the Dutch are there, but the Dutch shrink to almost total insignificance in the context of this whole strategic development. The bad news is that we don't seem to understand that this sinking ship cannot be righted. We can't fix it. They're deeply in debt. They're on the road into economic disaster, just as we are. So you put the whole picture together, it's worse than a clown show, because some of these people are seriously delusional. They don't seem to understand they're not living in the world they think they live in. And that's where we are. I don't know how you fix this, because President Trump is right there with them. He's decided to hitch his boat to the sinking EU Titanic. What a waste of time.
Yeah, it's really quite stunning. And in fact, it's interesting while we continue in the West to demonize Russia, and I've shown Mark Rutte here many times, Keir Starmer, Merritt's especially, just called him a thug and a war criminal and all that. When you see what the Russian side is saying to this, especially about this new threat of sanctions here, they still seem pretty calm and pretty professional and respectful. Here's Dmitry Peskov addressing the threat of more sanctions.
This unprecedented number of sanctions that have been imposed against our country over the past, well, one can say, almost 4 years already, have had no effect, and they have proven to be absolutely useless in terms of putting pressure on Russia. Russia consistently welcomes the point of view repeatedly voiced by the head of our state that it would be preferable for us to achieve our goals and ensure our security by political and diplomatic methods. But at a time when this is impossible due to the lack of reciprocity on the part of European states, on the part of the Kyiv regime, we continue a special military operation. And no sanctions will be able to force the Russian Federation to change this consistent position, which our president has repeatedly spoken about. We intend to continue moving in line with the peacekeeping efforts that the United States of America, President Trump personally, is making.
So they're still trying to reach out to Trump. They're still trying to say, hey, we're willing to talk to you guys. But they are unequivocally saying, and Putin himself said this a couple of days ago, we'll achieve our security objectives at the negotiating table or on the battlefield. As simple as that. And one thing I think, Doug, is just appears to be lost on many Westerners, or at least that's how it seems to me. that this is an existential issue for Russia, even if they actually had economic pain or something. I think the idea and the belief, and tell me if you think this is different, is that, well, if it gets financially painful enough, then Russia will just stop. But I don't think there is any pain pressure that will cause Russia to stop what they're doing until they achieve it, because they view this as an existential threat.
If you're sitting in Brussels or Berlin or Paris or London, and you objectively look at how money has been invested over the last 20 years, and I'm talking about money globally, you know that the Chinese have invested roughly $1 trillion in this One Belt, One Road project. And this project is all about transportation, infrastructure, pipelines, trying to knit together in some reasonably organized and integrated fashion all the potential trading partners on the Eurasian landmass and Africa together. That's $1 trillion. The United States alone has spent somewhere between $9 and $14 trillion, depending upon whom you want to refer to as a source. On what? On crushing Afghanistan, crushing Iraq, advancing into Syria, crushing Libya. In other words, we've wasted trillions and trillions on unprofitable wars of intervention that have brought us nothing but grief, in Europe nothing but an invasion of people that they don't want and can't maintain. So at some point, somebody in Europe, and I think Orban is leading the charge on this, but I think the rest of them are going to wake up and say this is a dead end, especially when it becomes clear that the Russians are not interested in marching all the way to the Polish border. Not to say that they won't do it if they're forced into it, but the bottom line is that's not what they've been about. They've never been about, well, we just want to capture more and more territory. Russia is already the largest country in the world. How much more territory do they need? And I think the answer is not much. But they've effectively reconquered or retaken or reannexed what was New Russia under Catherine the Great. That's something that made sense because the people that live in those areas were Russians culturally, linguistically. They're happy to do that. We don't seem to want to recognize any of that. We seem to want to maintain this artificial construct called the Cold War in new form. It's a dead end. It's not going to work. And I think the Europeans, who are now approaching a depression, frankly, total destruction in industrial and scientific terms, are simply going to wake up, put new people into power. They're coming. It doesn't matter how hard Merz tries to keep the alternative for Germany out of power. It doesn't make any difference. They're going to come to power. And when they come to power, they're going to reverse all of this. And the first place they're going to go is Moscow. They're going to have a meeting right away. And they're going to throw out all this nonsense. And you're going to see the Germans march out of NATO at high speed. And remember that one of the arguments for all of this nonsense was we have to keep the Germans in NATO. That's part of the rationale for hostility to Russia, because that means Germans and Russians won't cooperate. And if Germans and Russians don't cooperate, we can live with the status quo in Washington in perpetuity. Everyone is vassalized in subordination to us. All of this is failing. It's all going to collapse.
You know, you mentioned this Cold War mentality and even a lust, if I can use that term, to go back to the Cold War mentality, go forward into a new one. One of the ways that the current leadership, they may get out of power one day, they're not yet. And these guys that are in power keep talking about this coalition of the willing, or this reassurance force, and they keep going down this path, and they still are to this day trying to get Trump to agree to, not only to agree to it, but to participate in it with some kind of, whether it's air support, logistics, etc. They keep saying, hey, whenever this is brought to some kind of negotiated settlement, we want our troops in this demilitarized zone of support, which is odd because if you have military there, it's not a demilitarized zone, but nevertheless, they want those in there. Well, Putin, again, being very plain and plain spoken, said a couple of days ago, that ain't happening.
If some troops appear there, especially now while the fighting's continuing, we proceed from the premise that these will be legitimate targets for destruction.
And you can see there that venue thought that was a really good idea, that they would be destroyed of those. So that's not something that would scare a lot of Russians. Many of them are actually pushing more aggressively in that path now. What does that tell you about the state of affairs and the likelihood that this war can come to any kind of conclusion soon?
Well, there are two things that have to be taken into consideration. The first is the use of this terminology, coalition of the willing. This goes back to the 1990s. Almost immediately after the Soviet state collapsed and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, there were people in Europe that were happy to be part of NATO, but they saw NATO as being exclusively defensive. And so when the Yugoslav Civil War peaked, and we made the decision to exploit the confusion and chaos in Yugoslavia by attacking the Serbs, whom we blamed, rightly or wrongly, for everything that was wrong in Yugoslavia and in the Balkans, you immediately had to turn to this new phrase, coalition of the willing, because most of your alliance members were not interested in going to war with the Serbs. In other words, they weren't interested in a military intervention and sustaining it. So we held these meetings to get people on board to supply troops, to provide resources. And many members would say, okay, well, we'll ship you some trucks. We'll send a medical support team, but we don't want any soldiers involved. We have to understand that the notion of a coalition of the willing within the framework of the NATO alliance is an expression of weakness, not strength. I mean, if you're trying to convey the impression to the Russians that you have this enormously powerful alliance that stands to destroy them or defeat them if they refuse to do whatever it is that we want them to do, and you turn around and say, "Oops, so wait a minute, what we really have is a coalition of the willing," and that means the French and British armies that together, they're actually meaningless as a hill of beans concept. They're just not meaningful forces. And oh, by the way, well, the Germans are now going to spend money. Well, they're going to spend money, but German nationalists inside the German army, people that are fed up with the terrible leadership in Berlin, are now being driven out of the army. Well, if you're going to drive nationalists out of the army, you're not going to have an army. That all of us, everyone who serves in his respective or her respective country in uniform is by definition a nationalist. So the whole thing is a catastrophe. It has no chance of success. And the idea that some portion of Ukraine could be occupied by the so-called coalition of the willing is rightly dismissed out of hand by Putin, because why are the Russians fighting? They are fighting to prevent adjacent territory from being occupied by foreign forces that are hostile to Russia. Now, if that's the raison d'etre for the war, why would anyone think that you could pick a piece of Ukraine, whatever is left over, and say, well, we'll settle for this. So we have our toe in the pond. We can say we still own a portion of the pond. It's meaningless. It's stupid. It's unacceptable. But that's
let me ask you just on the logic of it, because we to the Western audience, it does sound tough. It's, man, we're going to put these, combat troops in there, and that's going to be a real deterrent. That's going to keep Putin from going further, and it will serve as a deterrent for him to do that in the future. But then one has to ask, and I think that the Russians are very keenly aware of this, is that if you're not willing to fight for Ukraine today, why do you think that they would be willing to fight and die for Ukraine tomorrow? I don't understand the logic of that.
Well, this has always been the issue. The real question, I think it was Anatol Lieven who raised the issue. He said, this will be decided by the people who are willing to fight. In other words, the Ukraine war. He said, now the Ukrainians are willing to fight, but what about everybody else in NATO? And that answer was, well, not so much. And the one nation that sent forces over there and swore allegiance to the Ukrainian state and died in great numbers for the Ukrainian state were the Poles. And now the Poles at least have sobered up to the extent that the new president says there will be no more Polish soldiers in Ukraine. Well, that's a good thing. But in the final analysis, your point is accurate. Nobody's interested in dying in Ukraine. People in France or Germany or Austria or any of these other countries, have no interest in marching 1,000 miles east in order to come to grips with the Russian army. I I mean, what a dumb idea. That's the biggest mistake you could possibly make. So, at this stage, it's shadow boxing. There's nothing serious about it. That means that it's up to President Putin, his inner circle, to make the decision. And I think we're seeing the beginning of that with this punishing strike. I think they're going to go after all of the targets of command and control, which means the people who are in charge over in Ukraine. And I think they're going to start moving further west. Now, will they go all the way up to the river and stop? I don't know. But if you talk in terms of creating neutral zones and occupied zones, the Russians will have to go through because they won't accept that. That's sort of like saying, well, we just fought a war in Mexico, and northern Mexico is going to be a neutral zone. No one is there, and it'll have its own independent government. Then central Mexico, well, that's going to be something else. We're not really sure what it is yet, but it could be, have the presence of foreign forces in it. I mean, it's crazy. We would never accept that. Why would the Russians accept it? So we need to be honest, but we don't want to be honest, because to be honest means the premise for the war itself was always stupid. It was never correct. It was never necessary. We created this mess, and I'm serious. It's Washington, because you pull us out of this equation, it's over. And President Trump should understand that, but he is doing the opposite of what I thought he would do. He's doubling down on the policies of his predecessor. He's making a confrontation with Russia over Eastern Europe, over Eastern Ukraine, more likely, not less likely. And we all know another war is beginning to take shape in the Middle East. That's inevitable. Does he really think he's going to get any cooperation out of Moscow or Beijing or anybody else in a war between Israel and Iran? No, he's not. This is the sort of failure to think on multiple levels. No one looks at the implications. No one has done, as we used to say in the Army, branch and sequels for an operation. None of that has happened. And unfortunately, that's not something that President Trump is inclined to do. He's very resistant to the kind of study and preparation that would go with a meaningful summit.
And Doug, I have to wonder really what is in the mind of the president, because on the one hand, he talks about, I want to get a negotiated deal. I want to get this thing over with. I want to get the killing stopped, etc. He's going to talk to Putin. Apparently he's going to do it again this week. We'll see what comes of that. But you just saw, we trotted out Besant there, and he's going to try economic warfare again, which was a complete and utter disaster. And then you have members of President Trump's party in the House of Representatives seem to also be going in a direction to where we're looking at maybe trying to put some pressure points on China and India and several others, as was voiced here by Representative Mast over the weekend.
We have to deal with those that are on the outside that are still allowing, because of their relationships, their cooperation, Russia to continue this war. And it really puts to a fine point that because of cooperation, Russia, China, India, North Korea are essentially at war with Ukraine, Europe, the United States of America because of those cooperations.
I mean, what the hell are you talking about? They're at war with us, and that's something that we want to pursue. Because and even before you comment on that, let me show you what the other half of that equation is from the Russian side, talking about where they're going with those very same members of the axis of evil, if you want to go back to that. Here's the Lavrov.
It is a demonstration that three great powers, representing three great civilizations, are aware of the commonality of their interests in a number of areas. This does not mean that everything coincides 100%, but there are clear tendencies for China, Russia, and India to develop their partnership, deriving mutual benefit from the areas where we have the same interest. And these interests lie in the development of the economy, in solving social problems, and in improving the well-being of the population. All this perfectly fits into the overall concept of the RIC trio, which was predicted back in the mid-1990s by Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov. Since then, it has taken shape, and numerous meetings have taken place. At present, we are preparing the next format of the trio, first at the level of foreign ministers. I am sure that later we will also think about a special summit.
So we've seen, Doug, that all of our actions from the Biden administration forward have shoved all of these folks together, and now then they're taking advantage of that, and they're actually forming a pretty powerful economic bloc. And now then we're talking whether it's Besant or Mast and part of Trump's party seem to be trying to shove them more together. I mean, what do you make of this contradiction?
Well, you've got to understand the mentality in Washington, D.C., of which President Trump has simply become a part. We used to think he would be different. He's not. He's indistinguishable from everybody else inside the Beltway. What is this mentality? If you go back to the 50s and 60s, as we began to develop these alliances and these trade relationships, our economic partnerships resulted in the militarization of our relationship with foreign countries. Because at the time, if you traded with the United States, it meant that you probably didn't trade with the Soviet Union or the communist China or anybody associated with them. So we militarized our trade alliances, trade relations. So we're looking at what's happening with BRICS, and we are imputing the same desire to militarize relations that we have had. In other words, we're projecting our predisposition on the Russians, the Chinese, and the Indians. Well, that's stupid, and it's uninformed because, quite frankly, those countries are, contrary to what was asserted, they're not interested in going to war with us at all. What they're interested in is what I was pointing to before with China. We spend trillions to intervene in countries, then we try to change those countries into a facsimile of ourselves. Then we link those countries economically, we think, to our interests. That's not what the BRICS Belt and Road concept, the Shanghai Cooperation Council, none of those organizations are about that. They are genuinely about building shared prosperity. So trillions are going into the investments that will make them wealthy and successful. If you watch the parade in Beijing, lots of people were convinced that they were watching evidence for China's readiness to march all over the world and conquer everything. Not on your life. What you see is how prosperity is the foundation for defense. That's what you were watching. That is something that Eisenhower understood. Prosperity is key to defense. Without effective economic strength, development, and the prosperity that flows from it, your society fails, and more important, your military has no chance of success. That was the great lesson that he took from the Second World War. We've thrown that overboard. We focus exclusively on threats, backing those threats quickly with not just the threat of sanctions, but also the use of military power. You know, why would you have a summit with President Putin at Elmensdorf Air Force Base in Alaska? You welcome him, and what do you have? A raid all around you. All of these combat aircraft. What do you have above you? An overflight by a B-2. What's the point here? Is that something that you would expect at such a meeting? If you're trying to form, develop, foster a positive relationship in pursuit of prosperity and peace, is that what you do? Highlight your military capability and power? It would have made more sense had he a guard from the old guard and the Marines or something standing there in full dress uniform with a band. That would have made sense, and had both the Russian and U.S. national anthems played. That's what you should have done. That's not what we did. We did the opposite. So again, Trump is all about threats and bullying, and he's not going to accept anything that doesn't make him look good. He's going to reject any solution that does not place him at the center as the one who is in charge and is responsible for everything. It's a catastrophe. That's not what this is about. He's forgotten that he's the president of the United States and is leading the American people. The American people have no interest in going to war. The few that want to cheer bombings from the sidelines need to be ignored. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. They've never been to war. They'll never go. They are a danger to our society. because of the cavalier way in which they addressed this issue of war. So I don't know what you can do at this stage. Obviously, we have to hope for the best, but I think Besant is on a fool's errand. The Europeans will desert this. Everyone will desert it because everyone wants to trade. Now, hopefully you can trade on a basis that is mutually beneficial. That's what we should be focused on. That can be achieved. But
Yes.
no one is interested in going to war, least of all the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians. It's all nonsense.
And you know, the one constituent that is very much interested in war is Volodymyr Zelensky, and I think all of these things, when you see Trump, you know, making all these threats, but then not following through with them, but then now talking about going down sanctions, that's just music to Zelensky's ear. He was interviewed on ABC News over the weekend, and he was reinforcing that. Yes, that's definitely what we need to do. We need to put more oil sanctions because that will crush the Russian economy and bring them to the table, et cetera. But then he goes on this, I think, really disconnected from reality, part 17, and exposed why he just can't figure this stuff out. Here's what he's saying now is his definition of victory.
What does victory look like in Ukraine?
Victory, to my mind, Putin's goal is to occupy Ukraine. This is to destroy us, occupy. And did he occupy it?
No.
It mean that he didn't win. It means that we have Ukraine.
But he still wants to win.
Yes, but till he didn't occupy us, we win. And I think so, because we have our country. And of course, he understands it very clearly. He wants, of course, to occupy us totally. For him, this victory. And until he can't do it, the victory is on our side. Very painful in the war, because a lot of losses. So that's why for us to survive is a victory, because we are surviving with our identity, with our country, with our independence.
Talk about kind of moving the goalposts. You remember at first it was, we're going back to the 1991 borders. We're going to recapture Crimea. And then it was in 23. Well, all right, we're going to go to the Azov coast. We're going to break through there. And now it's just, well, he hasn't occupied everything, so we're a winner. I mean, what does that tell you about the mentality on the Ukraine side and their willingness to actually make a negotiation to end the war?
Well, the first question is, who is Zelensky? Who appointed him or put him in position? Remember the platform he ran on when he first came into public view? And that was a peace platform. I will settle issues with the Russians. And that's one of the reasons that he was widely supported all over Ukraine, both in the eastern Russified portions of the country and the rest of the country. Now, he lied, obviously. So who backed him? Who put him there? If you look at the people that are behind him, they're all fundamentally committed to the destruction of Russia. And as I've said many, many times, who is Zelensky representing? When he says our identity, I'm 100% for the survival of the Ukrainian identity and the Ukrainian nation and people. But the Ukrainian nation and people are not identified closely or perfectly with the borders that existed. And back in the 90s, even Brzezinski tried to persuade President Clinton that he needed to raise the issue of borders in Ukraine, because Brzezinski privately said Eastern Ukraine is Russified. It's not genuinely Ukrainian, and it hasn't been for a very long time. But these issues never come up for discussion because we have taken a position that borders anywhere, everywhere cannot change. But we know from the last 500 to 1,000 years of European history that borders in Europe have repeatedly changed. They change all the time. And it is by changing borders, sometimes by moving populations around, that you eventually achieve peace, which is why the crown heads of Europe did those things. It's primarily because they did not want wars to continue indefinitely. He is doing things that make no sense for the Ukrainian population. I wish we had time and we could put a series of maps up over the last 500 years and show you what this entity called Ukraine looked like at any given point in time. and at least a third or more of it was never part of Ukraine. That's the bottom line. And this construct is not meaningful. It has never been that meaningful. And it's the first thing that should go down and go away in favor of something that's sustainable. And we have refused to do that because we see benefit or profit in our minds from keeping Russia at war in Ukraine.
Now, as I mentioned at the top of the show, everybody in Europe doesn't have this amnesia or this lack of ability or willingness to see reality. Some actually do. And kind of in light of you're talking about borders changing there, somebody said out loud yesterday at a speech in Hungary, Viktor Orban is saying, hey, look, this war is already over. He claims that the United States already knows this, that Russia won, and predicts that it's going to be broken into 3 different zones. One, a Russian zone, which in the speech, I watched part of it this morning, he said that already exists. That's not even can happen. It already has. He said the only question is how big is the demilitarized zone going to be, and how big is the Western zone going to be? What do you make of his comments?
Well, no doubt he's revealing in public what the discussions are behind the scenes inside NATO and probably the European Union. I'm sure that these kinds of things have come up for discussion with President Trump. The problem is as follows with the 3-zone solution that's presented. First of all, the notion that there is an independent Ukrainian state of any kind, in any shape, that is aligned with NATO and the West is an impossibility. That's the reason the Russians are at war. They are not going to allow any advance of the NATO alliance and its forces beyond the Polish border, the Slovakian border, the Romanian border into Ukraine. Absolutely impossible. So I certainly understand the discussion about a neutralized zone or a demilitarized zone. That makes sense. But whatever government does emerge west of the Dnieper River and is going to be centered up, presumably, I guess, in Kiev, it cannot have foreign forces inside its borders. And, if you listen to this man, Rosenberg, who works for BBC, and he's challenging Peskov with the idea, well, what's wrong? Isn't Ukraine a sovereign nation? If they want to have foreign forces inside their country, isn't that their right? Of course, Peskov, is very polite, but this man Rosenberg has missed the boat on the war entirely. He doesn't understand that Polish border, that eastern border is it. That's the limit of advance for foreign troops. There will be no foreign troops in Belarusia. There will be no foreign troops in Ukraine. And anybody who studies the Austrian State Treaty, which is still a good model for the resolution of this conflict, sees in there no foreign bases, no foreign forces, no foreign military codes, just listed. And the Austrians signed up for it. How's that worked out for Austria? Pretty damn well. In fact, their standard of living for the first time, I would say in several hundred years, is far and away better than the standard of living inside Germany, which has now impoverished itself and is falling apart. A society that is divided, uninformed, and rebellious. Austria is in far better condition. So the whole thing, I like Orban, and I think he's onto something, but I don't see any foreign forces anywhere in Ukraine ever.
Yeah, it doesn't look like the Russians do either. And but we'll keep our eyes on this one and continue to track it. But before I let you get away today, I want to look at another part of the world. You mentioned a little bit about the Middle East. But then even aside from that, there's something going on in our own hemisphere regarding Venezuela. The United States has destroyed what we claimed was a drug boat. We have over the past weekend or so publicly said at the government level that we might be willing to use military force inside of Venezuela to go after drug traffickers. We have said we may use military force in Mexico as well. And then just in the last few days, there's been Marines practicing amphibious landings from the Iwo Jima on the coast in Puerto Rico for the first time since 2003. And one has to wonder what all these rumblings are. What do you make of what's going on in Venezuela?
Well, the president might consider using the Marines to go inland in Puerto Rico and clean out the various gangs and criminals that control many of the back streets in the towns of Puerto Rico. The only place that is completely safe is San Juan, and that is really the old city. And that's a shame because Puerto Rico is a beautiful place, but anybody who spent any time there knows just how dangerous it is once you penetrate the center of the island. But having said that, let's get back to reality here. We're talking about Venezuela. If you go back to the president's first term, you had Elliot Abrams, who is sort of the archdeacon in the church of neoconservatism and Trotskyism. He's a big advocate for intervention. We see many of the things that he was saying being sort of repackaged and put into the discussion. And you hear people saying, well, we're already at war with Mexico. We're already at war with Venezuela. We're already, well, what else are you going to include? You're going to say we're already at war with Panama. We're already at war with Colombia, blah, blah, blah. And then the other point is, well, we have to do this because if we don't go into these places, the Chinese will. Well, the Chinese do go into a lot of places, but they don't bring the Chinese military. They come in with engineers and technicians, and they usually come in after a cooperative arrangement has been agreed to on the economic level. That seems to be in the offing right now for Venezuela. The Chinese are doing something that we should have offered to do a long time ago, in return for which we could have had most of our interests identified and met by the Venezuelans. And that is to completely restore and repair the dilapidated oil and gas fields that Venezuela's got. We don't understand that the competition between the various powers around the world is really no longer military, because the military competition has failed. Anybody who looks at what we have done since the end of the Second World War, and certainly since the Korean War, it hasn't worked. Our military interventions have all been catastrophic failures. The rest of the world says, well, we're not going to do that anymore. And I think the Russians figured that out. I mean, if you learned anything from communism, you learned that it's an economic disaster. It doesn't work. And that you make relations work between countries on the basis of economic commonality of interest. And that's effectively what Sergei Lavrov was talking about. He's absolutely right. That's what Rubio should be saying. And we should be interested in doing business in Latin America and get out of the business of regime change. Get out of the business of trying to punish somebody because they're doing business with somebody we don't like. See, this is the problem with American global military and financial hegemony. People are sick of it. They don't care to be dictated to. And unfortunately, that's what we do. We show up in various parts of Africa or Latin America, and we say, well, unless you do the following things and you meet our standards for whatever it is, human rights, the supposedly liberal democracy, which of course is a joke, then we're not going to do business with you. And not only are we not going to do business with you, we're going to punish you. You look at Ecuador, look at Peru, look at these various places. How many of their leaders have been removed at our insistence over the years? We can't do this anymore. We need to get out of that business. And we have to build relations with all of these countries on the basis of some commonality of interest. There may not be any cultural commonality. That's fine. It doesn't have to be. But there is usually a strategic commonality of interest based on shared economic development and so forth. We've got to get out of this sort of straitjacket of hostility and conflict with the rest of the world. We all thought that Trump might do that. We've gotten education. We now know he won't. And as a result, things are going to get worse for us, not better.
Right. Yeah. And Gary, if you can bring that full screen up there of the Kathleen Tyson tweet there, that X post, because it shows a lot of the issues that you were mentioning there about some oil issue that's in Venezuela, and how you're saying, this is what China is getting ready to do, which we could have done. What do you make of the claim by some that this might be at the heart of what we're really interested in Venezuela, not so much actually interdicting the drug trade, which is the surface level claim, but that we may have our eyes on Venezuelan oil? Do you put any credit to that?
I think that the arguments in that post are all legitimate. The problem is that the use of American military power is not the solution to our problem. You know, he talks in there about the numbers of oil rigs that are still in operation, 1/3 of the count a decade ago. We've got to go back further than that. When's the last time we built an oil refinery? How many active refineries do we have today compared with what we had in the past? We have neglected all of the things that are important at home. And again, we voted for Trump because he promised to end domestic neglect. In other words, he would turn to the infrastructure, he would turn to the criminality, he would do something about the border and immigration and so forth. He's done some of it, but it's a fraction of what he needs to do. And unfortunately, this desire, this appetite, insatiable appetite for overseas adventurism is crushing anything positive that he might do at home. And then when you look at what he's assembled in the Caribbean, I don't think he expects 4,000 Marines to do a great deal in Venezuela. Of course, I'm sure we have CIA mercenaries and agents and so forth in nearby Colombia, maybe in Guyana, all of whom can operate in conjunction with the Marines. And most of the 26 or 27 million people in Venezuela are on the coast. But you're not going to exert any positive control for very long. You're going to end up dealing with a very hostile population, not because they all love Maduro. That's not the point. But even the weakest people in the world will usually prefer the people they have in their armed forces, in their police, and in their government to us and whatever we want to impose. So the answer to Venezuela right now is not to double down on what is ostensibly a failed policy in the region, which is to threaten everybody. We've got to get out of that business and look instead of, well, what are the interests of the state? And if we don't like the president, that's fine. President Trump doesn't have to meet with him. He needs to send somebody else. But you've got to sit down with these people, understand their interests, and find a way to create that commonality that we were talking about before. And remember, we could go in there very, very quickly with a couple of thousand technicians and engineers and do brilliant work inside Venezuela to rapport all of the oil and gas infrastructure. But we're not doing it because we decided we don't like the government. And he says, no, President Trump said, no, this is not about regime change. Well, if it's not about regime change, what's your problem with Venezuela? We're the ones that put up the CIA puppet, a few years ago and tried to shove him down the throats of everybody in Venezuela. So if it's not regime change, then do business with the regime. Whether it conforms entirely to your preferences is irrelevant. What's the business angle? And I would think that we could go in there and do a much better job than the Chinese. We're much closer to the United States. We have many, many more people that already speak Spanish. So I wouldn't bomb, attack, strafe, whatever it is, Venezuela at this point. I don't see how that improves things. And again, I think we discussed this before. Most of the drugs that have come out of Venezuela, and not very much, quite frankly, in comparison to other states, it's come out of Colombia, which is where the drugs originated. And we do know that generals in the Venezuelan army have managed to line their pockets from time to time by engaging in this. Well, you sit down and you talk to the Venezuelan leadership and say, look, we want to help you out. These things aren't really acceptable to us. And if we can correct this, then we can do business here. This is the art of the possible, which is really what diplomacy is all about. But to immediately forge this task force, start practicing for landings in Puerto Rico on the assumption that this is going to scare them into submission, I think it's a mistake. If anything, if somebody sits down, and I hope someone in the military is sitting down with the president, lays out the map, shows him what would have to be done, shows him the real requirement for forces, he'll say, well, that's crazy. I don't want to do that. I hope that would be the response, because that's the correct response.
Right.
Now,
and that did exist with that kind of logic.
Yeah, but by the way, people say, well, the Venezuelans will fight like tigers. No, they won't. That's not it. But once you're in the country, they're not going to be very happy to have you there. And they're going to make life miserable for you. The Iraqis in 2003 did not fight like tigers. We knew that would not happen. Okay, there was remarkably little resistance. We got all the way to Baghdad with 1 dead in the 3rd Infantry Division. So who are we kidding? That wasn't the issue. The issue is, what are you trying to achieve there? And is that goal going to be achieved because you put a lot of people, Americans in uniform with guns on the ground? I think the answer in Iraq was absolutely not. And it's not the right solution for Venezuela. And frankly, we have other things closer to home. President Trump has gone into Washington, and people are saying, oh, well, that's terrible. No, it isn't. Washington is a tragic place. That city has suffered with unending criminal action for too long. The place has been an embarrassment to us around the world. No capital of a great power like the United States should be allowed to sink to the levels that Washington has. President Trump is right about that. President Trump has talked about if you've got 3 or 4 people being killed every weekend, that's a war, and that's a war we need to stop. He's correct about that. All of those things that he wants to do that make sense are being put at risk by these overseas interventions, adding yet another failure to what is already a failed enterprise in Ukraine. I would argue a failed enterprise in the Middle East is not going to help him. It's not going to help the American people. It'll probably put everything that he wants to do at risk. He's starting to look a lot like LBJ. He has some things he wants to do domestically that are vital for the survival of our country, our social cohesion, the enforcement of federal law. But all of that could be lost by this overseas interventionism, this epidemic in Washington of great power-itis. Everyone wants to feel powerful, and you feel powerful when you're bombing somebody. All of that nonsense needs to go away. But he's doing both, and that's what LBJ did in Vietnam. And he should have realized early on, this is a disaster. He had plenty of people telling him that. And then Nixon, when he came into power, very few people are aware of this, but when he met with the Army generals, we're talking about the 4 stars who were in charge and some of the 3 stars, they all said, Mr. President, get out. We're not going to achieve anything in Vietnam. Just withdraw. And of course, he had people surrounding him in the White House, including Kissinger, who said, oh, no, you can't just leave. Well, the Soviets will think we're weak. The Chinese will think we're weak. Well, we now know in retrospect, they both couldn't figure out what we were doing there to begin with.
Right.
For the same reason that, we should never have gone into Afghanistan. We thought the Soviets were crazy for going into that place. We got to get out of this. But President Trump, instead of doing that, has turned in the opposite direction. And we could speculate for hours on why, but he has. And someone tried to tell me the other day, well, this is because there's this secret government, that we know nothing about. This is what Americans are becoming very conspiratorial now. There's a secret government. The same people who controlled Biden now control him. I'm not so sure. But I think President Trump has really shot himself in the proverbial foot. And the best thing he can do is send somebody to speak to Maduro, come up with some sort of solution, and then get all these troops out of there and diffuse the situation. Should do the same thing in Ukraine. I've done as much as I can do. We're out. And the Europeans, they're going to have new governments. Macron is in a lot of trouble. Starmer, my goodness, I'm surprised Starmer is still breathing, based upon the damage he's done to the British people. That's all going to end. These people are going to be gone. They're going to be replaced. And suddenly, Putin is going to have an audience in front of him, whether it's in Moscow or somewhere else. And they're going to put an end to this. And we're going to look ridiculous.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I worry about is that we have every opportunity, and you've laid it out since the Trump administration took office, all the ways that we could have done it, and we just keep shooting ourselves in the leg, the knee, the wrist. It just doesn't seem to stop, and I just worry that one day these cumulative costs could pile up, and it could cause something serious to actually happen. But we'll just have to wait and see what it is. I wish they were listening to you, but It is what it is. But thank you so much, though, for shining a light on what is the truth and what could be done. Even at this late 11th hour, like in the Venezuela thing, there is a way that could fix this, which kind of leads to this national conversation you're going to have in October in Dallas, because you're talking about, look, if they're not listening to common sense now, maybe it's time for a little bit of political change. Tell us a little bit about this.
Well, I think in Dallas, we'll have this panel, which has the judge, Judge Napolitano, as well as Natalie Brunell. Natalie Brunell is a great financial analyst, has a very clear grasp of what's happening in the financial world. And then, of course, I'll be there. I'll stumble through and do the best I can. But the bottom line is that this is supposed to be a conversation. We don't expect everybody to come in there and agree with everything that they hear from the panel. That's not the point. We'll answer the questions that are raised, and then we'll turn to the audience. So the audience will have a chance to challenge our answers or to provide different answers or both. And we want to do this over time across the country because we're trying to build the foundation for a third way, a third party ultimately, because we know we're dealing with a uniparty. Yeah, we've got good men like Thomas Massey, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ro Khanna, others that are interested in finding solutions that make sense. But frankly, the majority aren't. Too many of them are on the payroll of some lobby, not just the Israel lobby. There are many different lobbies. All you have to do is look at the pharmaceuticals and the enormous resistance they're presenting to RFK Jr. So the bottom line is we want to find out what people think. So that's why you need to show up, because you'll have an opportunity to express yourself. Now, we haven't got a cutoff date for ticket sales, but that could happen, especially as we close in on the numbers that we're looking for. And they are starting to pick up. I get the impression people buy tickets late at the last minute. If that's true, just keep that in mind. This may come before the end of September that we have to cut it off. So I would urge people, if you plan to buy, do it now. Don't wait.
Yeah, and there it is, the nationalconversation.org. You see the address there out there on the screen. That's less than a month away now, so don't miss out. If you're anywhere near Dallas, Texas, by all means, go and see that. And we highly affirm it. Look forward to hearing back from you, by the way, after that's over, how that went.
Well, I hope we'll see you out there. You know, I'd be very disappointed if I look into the audience and I don't see your smiling face.
I'll see if I can make something like that happen. We'll have to check.
You're from Texas. You're from Texas. You ought to be.
I'm from Dallas itself. That's actually my hometown.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, don't you have a big following in Texas, Dan?
You know, not so much since I left. I got to say, some people were happy to see me leave, I think. So,
well, the other person that's going to be with us on this panel is Dr. Ravazzi, and she's the one who will frame the questions and ask them. But she's a very well-educated, thoughtful person in her own right. She taught at the university level. She still teaches. And she has an interesting background. So you've got a group of people on the stage, I think, that it will be good from the standpoint of some diversity of opinion. I know that word diversity, we like to apply it to everything but thinking. We have,
right.
You know, but you really are going to see a diversity of opinion and thinking there. We don't all agree on everything. We may agree on 65, 70% of the issues, but you're going to see disagreements. And I happen to think that's a healthy thing.
Yep, I agree with you, and we'll be looking forward to that as well. But thank you very much for coming on today, and we appreciate you guys coming on today. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't before you leave. Also, make sure that you let your friends know that we are on podcast. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will find us waiting for you there. And for those who prefer to get their information via the written form, it's danieldavisdeepdive.substack.com. We have everything that you're looking for. So any way you need to get your information or your friends, be sure to pass this along. Don't keep all this to yourself. We need to share the wealth because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, and your friends deserve to hear it and see it too. Thank you very much, folks. We'll see you this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.